Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the 17th Sunday of Ordinary Time from the Gospel of John. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord. Since the first Sunday of Advent last November, we have been reading from the Gospel of Mark. It is the shortest Gospel, not long enough to carry us through the entire year. So, beginning today and continuing for the next 4 weeks, we hear from the Gospel of John. This story of Jesus feeding the multitudes is the only miracle story that appears in all 4 Gospels. In fact, the story is told 6 times, twice each in Matthew and Mark, once in Luke, and, as we've just heard, once in John. 6 times? Perhaps that is God's way of telling us, pay attention, this is really important. So for the next 4 weekends, we will be paying careful attention to this story and what it has to tell us. To begin, how would you pull off a picnic for 5,000 with nothing more than a few fast food fish sandwiches? And that's not even counting the youngsters, who eat more than the adults do. Perhaps you would do it as this story is typically depicted in the movies. Baskets magically appearing out of nowhere, overflowing with bread and fish, more than enough for everyone. And maybe that's how it happened. I don't know. I wasn't there. But after Jesus had changed 180 gallons of water into vintage wine, this must have seemed, by comparison, a piece of cake. That's one of the great things about these miracle stories. They never explain just how Jesus does any of these marvelous deeds. So, since we don't know, we are free to imagine just how they happened. And perhaps the way the movies tell the story is just how he did it, a sort of multiplication, although that word is not used in the gospel. But since we are imagining, imagine this. Since this story took place more than a few years before the invention of fast food restaurants, no one would think of going any distance away from home without bringing with them adequate provisions of food and water. This was, after all, desert country. But by now, The crowd had been with Jesus for some days, and perhaps supplies were running low. I may have enough for myself, but I'm not so sure I have enough for the people sitting around me. Maybe I should hold back. That thinking would have been understandable. But notice what Jesus does. He takes the little food he has and gives it away. And perhaps his example rippled through the crowd, with people bringing out and sharing whatever little they had. But lo and behold, instead of there not being enough, there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Now, since we don't know how it was done, we are free to decide. Which way do you think it was done? More importantly, which do you think is the greater miracle? A quasi-magical multiplication of loaves and fishes, something Jesus clearly could have done if he chose to, or thousands of people sharing whatever they had? Since we don't know, you get to choose. But notice something else. The youngster with 5 barley loaves and a couple of dried fish, the food of the poor in those days. It was all he had, perhaps enough to carry him for another day or two, certainly not nearly enough to feed this huge crowd of people. It was pitifully meager, yes, but it was more than enough for Jesus. In an amazing act of generosity, the lad gave what he had to Jesus, who then gave it away to others. It was that youngster's generosity that made the entire miracle possible. The next time you are up against something that may seem much bigger than you, far more than you could fix or manage, or perhaps when you are tempted to say, I can't do anything about that, remember this young lad. He gave Jesus the little bit that he had and discovered that his little bit made all the difference. What little bit of food or time or talent or whatever do you have that might just be enough to do marvelous things if you were willing to give it away? Apparently, even a little bit is more than enough for Jesus to do great things. If we're willing to offer even the meager stuff of our lives, we too may discover that God will do more with us than we could ask or imagine. An example. She had a wonderful time at her prom, but she couldn't help noticing that some of the girls she knew weren't there. Later that week, she asked around and was stunned to learn the number of girls who could not afford a dress for the prom. So she and a couple of her friends talked to their moms about giving their dresses to girls for next year's prom. A local dry cleaner agreed to be a clearinghouse next spring. Their 3 dresses were the beginnings of a miracle the following spring for seniors who thought going to the prom was a pipe dream. Try this one. It started a few years ago when a young mother with 2 children was seriously ill. Neighbors and friends organized to provide dinner for them. They soon discovered how many other families experienced similar crises, not to mention that food insecurity during the pandemic was a reality in their community as well. The local parish got involved, and now a freezer in the church basement is kept stocked with casseroles, hamburgers, and all kinds of prepared foods for families in need. The organizers never forget that it started with one dish of lasagna. Or this story. It was his first semester student teaching. He returned to the dorm each night with stories of the funny things his second graders did and said. One evening, he asked 2 of his buddies if they had an hour or two to help a couple of his students who were struggling in math and reading. His friends cautiously said yes. Teaching elementary school was not part of their career plans. But they came to the school the next afternoon and each worked with a student and never spent a more fulfilling hour in their lives. The kids were great, and the short time they spent together made a big difference in the second graders' schoolwork. That first completed math sheet and vocabulary list were the beginnings of a new after-school tutoring program organized by the college. Or one more. Maria is a white woman in her late 50s. She cleans toilets at a major sports arena. Every day, she comes to work lugging through the security line 3 duffel bags bursting with plastic Tupperware. She says little. She never smiles. She's dressed in whatever she can find at the St. Vincent de Paul thrift store. On this particular day, a new security guard is on duty when Maria comes to work. He gives Maria and her duffel bag of Tupperware the all clear and waves her through. But then he asks, "Excuse me, ma'am, I'm just curious, what are those containers for?" Maria's scowl quickly turns to a smile, and she begins to tell her story. 3 years ago, Maria was homeless. For years, she had lived under a highway overpass just a few miles from the arena. She spends her time outside of work caring for a sick friend who can barely move on his own. After every game, Maria fills the Tupperware in her duffel bags with leftover chicken fillets, burgers, and other uneaten treats. She brings it all to the homeless shelter where she used to stay. Maria explains, "The reason I took this cleaning job was so I could have access to all this leftover food. Usually, arenas just throw it away, but I know people who would really enjoy it." The security guard is moved by Maria's story and generosity, and he asks her, "Maria, what keeps you going? What sustains you?" "The goodness of people," Maria says simply. "It's like a shade went up on my window. When I was homeless, all I could see was how bad I was inside and that I didn't deserve a good life. When the shade lifted, I could look outside myself. I saw goodness that I never saw before. I just believe in a loving God, and I'm doing my part to share the good news." Prom dress, a casserole, an elementary school reader, leftover food, all pieces of bread and fish that become the beginnings of miracles. Like the boy in today's gospel who gives the little bit that he has, these good folks make use of the opportunities and resources they had, all simple and ordinary, to make good things happen for others in need. The community of generosity and gratitude that Jesus gathers in today's gospel is recreated each time we gather to worship. We are called by Christ to become what we celebrate, giving thanks for what we have received by sharing with one another our scraps of bread and fish, our talents, our riches, ourselves, working our own miracles of creating communities of Christ-like charity, doing the very thing that Jesus sent his disciples, that's us, to do. Thanks for listening.